listening to the Film Yappers, the podcast where two film buffs, with too many opinions and just enough credentials, dive deep into the movies you love, the ones you hate, the ones you pretend to have seen, or the ones you are ashamed to admit that you love. From cult classics to fresh releases, they break down what works, what doesn't, and why it matters, one reel at a time. Dr. William Wells, intellectual historian and culture critic, is joined by his co-host and independent filmmaker Ethan Korpinen. Yappers, take it away.
Okay, so this is our second official episode. I know you guys were probably expecting us to talk about Gene Hackman's films, The Conversation and Enemy of the State, from how we ended things with our first episode, but we decided to talk about something that's a little more relevant on the public consciousness right now. The film Conclave from last year, starring Ralph Fiennes, Isabella Rossellini, Stanley Tucci, John Lithgow, and many others. The filmmaker Edward Berger. It was nominated for many Academy Awards this year. Best Picture, Best Adapted Screenplay, which it won. Best Leading Actor for Ralph Fiennes, and a Best Supporting Actress nomination for Isabella Rossellini. There's probably a few more nominations that it got that I'm, not mentioning right now. But those are the ones that come to mind. Maybe Best Original Score. The score was definitely a standout in my opinion. And yeah, it's a pretty engaging film. It's based off a book by Robert Harris. It essentially follows the inner workings of the election within the Catholic Church after the sudden death of the previous pope. Egos clash, personalities clash, a lot of backstabbing from certain characters. Following the death of Pope Francis, the actual conclave is expected to happen somewhere between May 6th and May 12th. And so this film has already seen a huge boost in viewership in the past week for obvious reasons. So yeah, is there anything you wanted to add?
Quite a bit. I could probably talk for the next half hour about all the observations I have about the film. It's probably not a film that people that are looking for, people that are devout Catholics may find some problems with this film. So I'll just
as they already have.
As they already have.
Yes.
I'll put that out there. However, as a film in its own right, I think it's very solid. And you mentioned the soundtrack. Is there anything that Ralph Fiennes is in where he's not an incredible actor? I mean, he's an A-list actor for a reason, and he's just riveting in a film that's basically about a bunch of old men talking. So there's no action, and this is marketed as a thriller, mystery thriller. But unlike most mysteries where there's a dead body, you're trying to find out who was the murderer. This one begins with a dead body, but it's not about who killed the Pope. The Pope dies of natural causes, and instead we want to find out who in this conclave is going to be the next Pope. So I wanted to make put on my historian hat for a moment and just comment about the films that have been made about conclaves in the past. And there probably are a couple that are not on my list But basically, there've been about 8 cinematic portrayals of conclaves. And of those 8, we're going to forget the first 2. They're older. I will say The Shoes of the Fisherman from 68, that is considered kind of the gold standard when it comes to portrayals of the conclave. It's very respectful. It's very non-controversial in that way. So that is worth just putting out there if someone wants to look it up. The other one's a comedy, and so it's very unrealistic in its portrayal. Yeah, it's
right.
The Pope must die. It's not exactly, and that's from the 90s. The other portrayals, and some are pretty well known, especially I would say Angels and Demons, based on the Dan Brown, what do you call it, conspiracy thriller, a bit of a terrible book and probably a terrible movie. What I remember about Angels and Demons, by the way, when it came out, it was something I knew I would never see. But the trailer has Tom Hanks. It's the ancient threat of the Illuminati. And I'm like, I'm out. I'm, I'm out. I'm out. Not interested.
That's Illuminati. The Illuminati were a secret society dedicated to scientific truth. The Catholic Church ordered a brutal massacre to silence them forever.
To kind of finish out the portrayals, I will say that the 2 popes was very highly regarded in its depiction. Conclave, as far as historical accuracy, does rate fairly high, except maybe for the costumes and the setting inside the Vatican, because it appears that they're in some kind of brutalist architecture, gray walls, very stark. And I think a lot of people have even mentioned that the costumes for the cardinals are maybe a bit brighter than the traditional color and things like that.
Right.
That's not a deal breaker. I think it's faithful to what most people believe based on accounts from past cardinals throughout history, that this is sort of how a conclave goes. And so let's talk about what actually happens. The conclave is the meeting of the cardinals of the church, the princes of the church, as they're known, that assemble from all over the world 15 to 20 days after the Pope dies. That's kind of the typical time period. That has varied in the past through the Middle Ages. They essentially cloister themselves off from the world, and on the first day of the conclave, after a meal and some talking and people sort of gauging, who you're going to vote for, they will have an initial vote on the first day. And what that does is it puts the names of the candidates out there for people to consider. And of course, not to be too glib about it, but these men are praying, and they're, presumably they take the job very seriously, what they're having to do. But so these names are collected. They put a name on a piece of paper. This part is exactly how it goes. They'll have usually the dean, or maybe the general secretary, who collects the slips of paper in a anonymous type ballot box, and then they will record the names of the nominees. Okay.
Right.
That is all that happens on the first day of the conclave. And the secretary will read out the names and how many votes they got. So what you could expect is on the second day, people are going to go to bed, they're going to rest, they're going to pray about it, have another meal, talk with their friends. Can you believe so and so got this many votes? So forth. They will start voting again. This time, you can almost imagine, and by the way, it is funny. I mentioned this to some of my history students. It's a bit like the Iowa caucuses, because what happens is people start to coalesce around different nominees if they are in the room. So again, this is an important point. A lot of people don't realize this. Any human being can be pope. In fact, they don't even have to be Catholic. You could even argue that they don't even have to be Christian. All that matters is that 2/3 of the cardinals vote on this person. Okay. And incidentally, this is similar to the film, but for 2025's purposes, there will be 135 cardinals that will vote, and they need 90 or more votes to confirm a pope. So it's similar to that in the film. I think maybe they have fewer in there.
There aren't that many nominees in the film. From what I remember, there's Lawrence, who's in charge of the conclave.
Yes.
For a good chunk of the film, he does have the lowest amount of votes. John Lithgow's character, Cardinal Tremblay. Tremblay.
Yeah, okay, so he's Tremblay. Okay.
Yeah, I think Bellini's Stanley Tucci.
Stanley Tucci? Okay, I may have got those mixed up.
Who's kind of more on the
liberal.
Tedesco kind of wants to take the church back to its
he's the conservative
roots.
Yeah, right, he's the conservative candidate.
Cardinal Lawrence is not necessarily as concerned about picking the Pope just based on, I guess, the social implications that might have. He's more concerned about picking one with kind of the cleanest track record and all that, with no history, no complaints,
no baggage.
That's kind of why he's the one who's really resistant to the idea of electing Cardinal Tremblay from the beginning, because he overhears something that the previous pope had actually dismissed him right before his death for some kind of. They don't really go into it, like specifically what it was, but they say it was some form of sexual misconduct. Never really elaborated on, but it's it's enough to make Cardinal Lawrence very wary to the idea of electing him. Adiyami, unfortunately for him, while he does seem like a good candidate, there is a kind of a plot kind of to defame him from. It's orchestrated by Cardinal Tremblay. He kind of digs up someone from Adiyeme's past, someone he had impregnated 30 years prior to the events of the film. It kind of damages his reputation within the election, and it kind of destroys any chance he might have had in winning, because I think prior to those events in the film, he was the second most favored candidate of the bunch. Yeah,
you're given all of these hints early on. Is this guy got some skeletons in the closet? Does he? Are they real? Are they not? So that's kind of another layer to the whole thing, which makes it kind of interesting, because you don't know who's going to come out of this unscathed or not.
Right.
There's not any talk about defrocking or, essentially removing Adeyemi or even Tremblay later as a cardinal. You would think that with some of these things, they might lose their position as a cardinal,
Right.
that would be up for the new pope to decide, I imagine. This movie was almost anticipating that, um, Pope Francis was in declining health this
Right.
past year, that it wasn't super sudden, and that they were already thinking who is going to carry on the more reform-minded legacy, which was the same within the film, that
Right.
the Pope that had just died, they're asking you to kind of imagine that's Francis. And the two cardinals that are very close to him, played by Tucci and Fiennes, they do represent kind of this reform-minded, whether you want to call them liberal or whatever term you want to use, they want to take the church in kind of a future direction, and it's significant that they both, they are American and British.
Right.
John Lithgow is a Canadian cardinal in the film, and he also appears to be, at least in the context of the conclave, moderate. He's not a, ultra conservative. The African cardinal is presumably fairly conservative. There's mention, and it's not. You almost wonder if it's going to be developed, and it's not developed. But there are bombings going on outside of the Vatican,
right?
And because they're cut off from all the media, and only Ralph Fiennes's character is let in on it. He has sort of a conduit to the outside. Tedesco is like, it's the immigrants that are bombing things,
right?
And it's like, what? Why are you saying that? It's all these immigrants.
Yeah, there was one point I wanted to address and get your opinion on, because there's one scene where, and this is right after Cardinal Tremblay is publicly exposed or accused by Isabella Rossellini's character, one of the nuns. She confirms Cardinal Lawrence's accusation, saying, I overheard their conversation, his conversation with the previous pope. But what I find really interesting is right after that scene ends, Cardinal Tedesco, he proceeds to take a hit from a vape pen, which I found very, it was kind of jarring, but it got me thinking, like, what were they trying to communicate about his character? Because you don't put in something like that as an accident unless you're trying to communicate something.
Right.
Like
I mean,
because
that might as well be Chekhov's gun.
It wouldn't surprise me if he smoked, but he uses kind of like an ultra modern device to do that. Yeah, so I found that.
That's a great point, and I hadn't really thought about it. Because in other contexts, there are things that you could use a vaping pen to represent. You could use it to say, this guy is adapting. He adapts to new technology. He's given up smoking in order to vape. That would be one thing. It would be something to mark you as part of the younger generation, because it's certainly, older people that vape look foolish.
Right.
It's very much a younger,
or just anyone who vapes looks foolish. By the way, any directors and screenwriters out there, you want to make a character unlikable, just throw in a scene where they're hitting it from, taking a hit from a vape pen.
Give him a rig.
That'll do the trick immediately. It's magic, I'm telling you.
Give him a mod. Give him a mod, a rig. I wanted to point out too, something that we didn't talk about, that once they start voting, they can vote up to 4 times a day.
Mm-hmm.
And when the votes are all in, they're recorded, they're destroyed so that no one's votes can be held against anyone. You know, I'm sure that the Cardinals on some level know which faction, how they're voting, and so forth, but you don't know individual votes because they're on a single piece of paper that are destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
But the way they destroy them is what the outside world knows. And so, there is this very special chimney where the ballots are burned and along with chemicals. And so, and they did depict this just very, very in a brief way in the film.
Mm-hmm.
But for people looking forward to the real conclave here, what you can expect is video cameras, probably even a live feed. I would not be surprised if there'll be a live feed of the chimney, because when the ballots are burned, if there is no pope chosen in that ballot, they put a certain kind of chemical in with the ballots, and you get black smoke from the chimney. That means we don't have
Okay.
a pope.
Hmm.
If, however, once the ballot, you have 2/3 of the Cardinals vote for a selection, then they put a different chemical, and the smoke is supposed to come out white, and that's how they essentially announce habemus papum. We have a pope. That's the term they use. And but what is funny, if you've been around like I have and you've seen a couple of these in the past, sometimes it's hard to tell if the smoke is black or white. It's gray.
Mm-hmm.
And so they keep adjusting the chemical formulas. So I am curious. That is something I'm curious about here in a few days. If we're going to get very clearly black smoke and white smoke, or if it's going to be one of those things where the news commentators are arguing
Mm-hmm.
over is that white or is it off white? Is that gray? What is that?
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? But they do depict that in the film,
Right.
and but it's not a big issue.
Yeah.
Uh,
Is there one thing I can address real quick? If
of
you're not done
course.
with your point, I
No,
can.
no, that was my point. That was
Okay,
my point.
gotcha. Okay, so there is a theme that's kind of explored, at least that from what I took away from my viewing of the film is the difference between a leader who is I guess a candidate in election who is eager to win or eager to run, right? And you have a leader that's
Mm,
maybe reluctant, right? Like he's thrown
hmm.
into it.
Yep, yep.
Cardinal Lawrence doesn't want
Yep.
to win the conclave, but I find it interesting that many of the other candidates see him as the best choice.
So, um, here's a historical note for you. Um, George Washington, our first president, was a reluctant president.
Mhm.
And after serving 2 terms, he said, enough. I want to retire, go home to Mount Vernon, and turn over power to the next person. So this was seen by Americans at the time that Washington, part of his greatness is that he was like Cincinnatus. Okay. And Cincinnatus was a Roman general who served, was extremely popular. Everyone loved him. But when his time of leadership was over, he resigned. He didn't hang on to power, and he went back home to his farm. That would lead to a George Washington society called the Society of the Cincinnati, and that is where our city, Cincinnati, is actually named in an indirect way after George Washington. A lot of people don't realize that that's where that comes from. But this idea of the reluctant leader. So very much it is, I think you're absolutely right that this is a good message and a prominent message. I'm sure that many of us as viewers, because Ralph Fiennes is the protagonist in the film, a lot of us are really rooting for him.
Oh, yeah.
Because he's clearly a good man. And he has already said the last thing a sane person would want to be is Pope. Nobody should want that. And that's the problem with leadership. A lot of times, the people that want to be leaders are the people that you shouldn't have as,
yeah.
You should pick a reluctant, person. And so many of these cardinals are jockeying for influence and position. And again, I'm not going to spoil it, but let's just say that the person who arises is not trying to grasp the job. They're not trying to marshal votes and so forth. They're not lobbying for votes. They're not bribing anyone, anything like that. And I think that's a positive. It's a positive message. Now, there's more going on than that.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's more going on than that, and the viewers will have to evaluate that for themselves. But there are some implications in the film, and I'll say again, I think if you'd like to understand the very real conclave that's about to start, I think this is a good film to watch to get a sense of what it would be like. And I think it does a very good job of that. But I think that if you're looking for a pro-Catholic message, that is not going to be found in this. But I did want to talk about the context of the film. And I don't mean the immediate context. I mean the past 30 years. Starting in the late 90s, and very dramatically, I have to say, especially in 98 and 99, you started to see films where the Catholic Church is the villain. Not just portrayed negatively, but is actually the bad guy. They're just evil.
Right.
And nothing redeemable there. Films like The Order with Heath Ledger, Stigmata, Gabriel Byrne, and I think Patricia Arquette. That was 99. Last Days. There were a lot of apocalyptic films, obviously, in 99. And that was an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. End of Days.
Okay.
I'm sorry, End of Days. End of Days. And they just depict the church in a brutally negative way, as if everyone in the church is a degenerate. They're all corrupt. They don't really have faith in God. It's all just a power and wealth game. And you see that there have been very, very few depictions of the Catholic Church and the Vatican in particular that were positive. Right. I do think that Conclave does a fairer job than a lot of the films. Definitely, it's not against the church.
It's a little more nuanced. Yeah.
It's more nuanced, but it is making a political statement about the church.
Right.
And that leads me to bring up two
Which you could say is also unavoidable. You know, if you're making a film about electing the next pope, you kind of have to
for sure,
explore the political
I
implications of
think, yes.
whatever candidate ends up winning.
I wanted to reference South Park and
Okay.
the Evil series,
Okay.
because and their depictions of the Vatican and the Catholic Church they're very different, but they do have an element of underlying respect for the Catholic Church. Now, South Park famously did an episode on the scandals of the past 20 years. Okay. And the priest leaving South Park and going to the Vatican and finding out that the entire church is run by a giant queen spider from another dimension. Because what else would explain a lot of the behavior? Okay. But just in the past few years, South Park did another episode. That one about the priest was 20 years ago, at least. And so it was clear what they were saying. And they have not been shy about criticizing other religions. I think they have a pretty famous musical about Mormonism.
The Book of Mormon. Yeah.
Book of Mormon.
Right.
Scientology, quite famously. But here's the interesting thing. So they, same character, Father Mackey is his name. He is conflicted because the people that come to his church, they just mock him. His own parishioners just mock him because of those scandals. And he's sort of having a crisis of faith. And I won't go into all the details about it, but he comes to a really interesting conclusion. He says, I'm not going to leave the church, even if I have lost my faith, because even if the church is corrupt, then that means it's up to those of us who aren't to protect the children. Which was a fascinating take. Then you have the Evil series, which you know how I feel about it. I think it's masterful. I am very, very sad that they sort of ended it prematurely, got canceled. But again, this was the first time we've had a mainstream television show in decades where the Catholic Church was not portrayed as the villain. It was portrayed in, I would say, a neutral way where it was criticized, but also given there was positive things about not just the priests, the nuns, talking about trying to modernize the church, but not take it into a radical direction and things. And really, if you are interested in looking at different perspectives of the Vatican, that's my larger point. I think this film, I think those series that Jude Law has been in, I think South Park and Evil both have some really interesting things to say.
All right. Well, yeah, that kind of wraps up this week's episode of the film Yappers. Our next episode, we are finally going to discuss the Gene Hackman double feature of The Conversation and Enemy of the State. Stay tuned for that episode. And yeah, we're going to sign off now.